Alright, what's up? It's another time and it's another episode of the Tillian Thinker Podcast. I am your host, Darcy Apologist. Welcome, and we are definitely in for an interesting episode, needless to say. Got my energy a bit up from some Sonic. Helped kind of keep me up a bit. Just a little, not a smidge more. By the way, I just want to point out, I'm not sponsored by it, just, saying what's keeping me up for the day. Now, we're going to be discussing an interesting problem that not a lot of people consider these days, and the one thing that's easily able to be noted about it is that there is a particular debate that I had a while back when I was utilizing this argument, and that was the logical problem of the one and the many. Now, what do I say about the logical problem of the one and the many? Well, the logical problem of the one and the many is a philosophical debate and issue that exists regarding what is reality ultimately in the consisting of things. Now, there are people that I have discussed regarding this particular problem and how then they interact with it. When I had the debate with Abdul al-Razak on the matter, he was certainly one who didn't really take to or consider it as much, because he said it was like a weird question or a silly question regarding it, and I was just like, oh, it's not. It's a classical deal because, again, it's usually rare that you encounter some Muslims that are willing to engage in the realm of philosophy. One of the things that John Frame, person that is a thinker of Van Til, one of the students, notes this in what is found as the Van Til glossary on his website and even sometimes in his books. The one and the many problem. Quote, knowledge involves uniting particulars into universal categories. But if every particular is exhaustively described by universal categories, then it is no longer particular. But if some particularities cannot be described by universal categories, then they can't be known or they have no nature. The same problem can be described in terms of the relation of logic to fact and of that of subject to object. So, we're referring to what is known usually universals or particulars, but ultimately it's called the problem of the one and the many. So in other words, how can we have one and many, and which is ultimate? This debate goes all the way back between a teacher and his student. Aristotle, the student, and then Plato, the teacher. Plato would bring about what is described as the forms. That is, that everything is this ultimate unity or monism of things. And with it being this oneness or this monism of the forms in this unit, that everything comes together into unity, then that's what we have referred to is that there's, it's ultimately united in one. But then the question becomes, is then because therefore we have this ultimately one single thing that everything gets absorbed into to be unity, does that mean that therefore distinctions or particulars are fabrications? An example that I'm going to use with some of this in the quote from Vern Poythress is taking the horse. How is the horse ultimately a horse? Is it because it participates in being involved in horseness or being involved as a horse in that unity of what it means to be a horse as the species? If so, if that's how it ultimately is, then these distinctions between different kind of horse breeds and species falls short, because then it says, hey, there is then this oneness, and ultimately, therefore, so saying this different horse breed A and horse breed B, that's not real. It's just fabricated distinctions we make up. Everything is ultimately one. So therefore, when we say they're horse, that's not a distinction or a name that we ascribe that's fabricated. That's the reality. That's the unity. And Vern Poythress notes this in his book, Logic, a God-centered approach to the foundation of Western thought, to which he says in page 144, says, quote, how do the individual horses come to be? Perhaps they come into being by participating in horseness. But if they all participate, what differentiates them? How does the diversity come about if we start with only the abstract unity? These, and that's the end of the quote, these are the kinds of questions that Aristotle was starting to ask once Plato was mentioning this. And hence Aristotle responded with what is referred to as the categories, or the many over one. And so when this was mentioned, and Aristotle responded to it with the category solution, or the many over the one, then this ultimately states that, okay, the one is not ultimate, but the many is. The particular distinctions are what are ultimate. And unity is a fabrication that we have created. So, this also presents problems, though, because then ultimately it states that unity is a fabrication. And thus, on the same page of the book from Poythress, he says, the particulars, the individual horses, then they have priority. We invent the name horse to label him. The word horse is only a name produced by us after we have experience with horses. But how then does unity and the label of horse come about if all we start with is an absolute diversity? Is then the unity an illusion or convenient fiction? So far we have a solution that says one is ultimate. And note, it's ultimate and absolute are the key terms in these distinctions, because it's not just saying, hey, it's just this. It's absolute oneness or absolute diversity. That's what is ultimately being referred to there, is the absolute of the matter. And if we start with something that is absolute in its unity, then all that is plural or distinct or particulars, then these things, they just, they're fabrications. They are absorbed into the unity if there's just this complete and ultimate oneness or unity. But if everything is this complete particular distinction, these categories, then there is no unity. It's just, you're so diverse and you're so diverse that, like, for example, the horses, there's these different horse breeds, and they are them horse breeds. They have no unity with the other different horses, because horse is a unity label that we have invented and is not real, but a fabricated distinction that is not the ultimate thing in reality. We have ultimate diversity, absolute diversity. And so this is what comes to be the problem, because you have to find out then what is the solution to this. A lot of people will still try to say that there is no solution. Like, I know I was talking to the Muslim metaphysician, Jake. This was all in a Zoom call, by the way, so it's not like there's any documented things for this particular conversation, but who knows, maybe one day he'll make a video addressing it. But I know that whenever we talked at the time, because he was claiming to say that I didn't know what the logical problem, the one of the many, is, and trying to deal with it, even though I've read the literature that explains this stuff, and I've read and discussed what, some of the philosophers like Van Til and Frame and Bahnsen have noted about it. But the issue that comes about in dealing with it is that he would say that there is no solution, even to the Muslim himself, Jake, the Muslim metaphysician. But when I brought this up to the one Muslim, Abdul al-Razak, he had mentioned that everything is one and many, ultimately. End of story. But the problem is that he needs to then give an accounting for it, because here's the thing. When Plato responded with the one, what was his accounting of it? In the form of the issue of the forms. That his form argument or thesis and doctrine was what needed to be the solution behind it that accounts for everything being this one. So he had a backing for the one over many, but it was inconsistent ultimately with itself and with how reality is functioning. So then Aristotle proposes categories, or these particulars. But then that presented issues and arguments that even I believe Aristotle himself started to kind of see and was a bit of a self-critique about. But even then, other people still noted where the critiques are there, because the same kind of questions asked regarding unity being ultimate was asked about if plurality is therefore then ultimate. So, how then can we get behind the solution? Because you have some philosophers that are trying to state that we don't have the answer, and there's some that are going to say, well, we deal with one and many at the same time. There we go. I would argue that we would indeed have to say that everything is ultimately one and many. And in fact, that's what even the philosophers like Poythress would note. Poythress, and then you have Van Til. In Poythress's work on logic, a God-centered approach to the foundation of Western thought, pages 144 to 145 say, in the Creator, one and many are equally ultimate. God always exists in both in his unity as one God and in his plurality consisting of the three persons of the Trinity. We must avoid saying that the oneness of the Trinity somehow come about after one God exists, or that God is really one and that he merely appears to us as three when he interacts with us. This would be the error and the fallacy of modalism. We must also avoid saying that the diversity in God is more ultimate, so that the three persons exist first, and then somehow they join together into a three-member society that agrees to act jointly. This is the error of tritheism, or polytheism in the form of three different gods. So we can see that God is both one and many, and neither can be reduced to the other. So that's the quote from Poythress. Van Til, who, is the whole kind of like inspiration behind the podcast here, and he's also the guy that you see on the profile there, on the picture there. As Christians, and by the way, just to give the quote here, this is from Introduction to Systematic Theology, page 59. This is in the more up-to-date version that you'll be able to find. Let's see here. I got the copy actually right here. Is the second edition. So the second edition is where I get the quotation and the citation from. As Christians, we hold that in this universe we deal with a derivative one and many, which can be brought into fruitful relation with one another, because back of both we have in God the original one and many. We have in God the original one and many. If we are to have coherence in our experience, there must be a correspondence of our experience to the eternally coherent experience of God. Human knowledge ultimately rests upon the internal coherence within the Godhead. Our knowledge rests upon the ontological Trinity as its presupposition. So, we see that within God, we have this ultimate one and many. We have the one and many that's in reality within human beings. There's the different people like John, Jake, Luke, Matthew. You have these persons, and then you have the fact that they share and participate in humanity or humanness. But then, which is ultimate in the question, but we would say it's equally ultimate, the equal ultimacy of the one and the many, that you have us with that. We're able to have, saying us are able to be one in unity, and that many in diversity and plurality. But that's because for the main part, we have an account for that in the triune God, who is equally ultimate, one and many, with that regard. So it's quite an interesting session with this podcast, because I've always wanted to talk about it. Because every time I bring it up, sometimes to some people, they usually are kind of blown away sometimes when it's broken down. And I'm talking to even the atheists, to some. Like, I know I've talked with one particular Muslim friend for a while. Marshall is his name. And to this day, he can't really give an account for or explain it, because the one thing that I noted is that while indeed, after Aristotle and Plato for a bit, it just kind of fades away, that not a lot of people talked about it, that it was just kind of forgotten. But some did bring it up, and one of them being, in at least as far as what I have recalled and tried to look up, would be what is referred to as the early Muslim philosophers, Ibn Sina and Al-Farabi. According to what I found, they were under some heretical charges that eventually got brought about. The charges were about the issue of the knowledge of God, which this does deal with a bit of an epistemology-based question, because it's about how do we account for knowledge at that point. So, that being said, sorry, I had a little bit of a lost train of thought there for a second. I don't know. Could have been the air that just turned on there. So, yeah. That being said, so they were dealing with the issue of epistemology, as this does kind of engage in a bit with is knowledge of God, especially within its connection in relation to metaphysics. But that being said, what we can see from it is that they said that God's knowledge only deals with universals and not particulars. So they were starting to engage with this notion, but because they were so developed in their doctrine of Tawheed, or of oneness and Unitarianism, it eventually developed so much that they would say that God is a reflection of that unity or that oneness, that even the knowledge of God, of everything, because they don't deny that God knows all things, but rather that he knows all things via universals and not particulars. Because they said, Allah does know particulars, but he only knows them in the form of universals. So in other words, he would know the individual Muslims, but he only knows them by Muslim and nothing else within that regard to try to make distinctions, because then that would go against his Unitarianism or his oneness in Tawheed. And so, with that, we come across an issue. That's where they were considered a heretic for it by Islamic standards. They fall under the logical problem that got proposed to that. But hey, the main reason why they tried to do that to begin with is because they started with their ultimate presupposition in the doctrine of Tawheed. So it would logically follow that they would state something like that, because they started with the idea that Allah is ultimately one, absolute oneness. So ultimately, reality would then have to try to account for it in the Islamic position from the oneness of God. And therefore, reality is ultimately one over many, not one and many. And so, this was the position that was affirmed by these two philosophers. And then they were critiqued for it by a philosopher at the time, because eventually this work that he then started to post about it is what started to kind of get him out of the realm of philosophy, which was Al-Ghazali. And he had a critique of that, so he would disagree with them on the manner of their solution and show where it has problems not just philosophically, but also problems theologically. And so, boom, they're out. They got removed from that whole deal. And it's kind of since then that's when the dialogue about what does reality ultimately consist of kind of ends, at least as far as my knowledge on Islamic philosophy goes. If someone can find another thing that deals with it after Ibn Sina and Al-Farabi, then I'm more than willing to get the literature regarding that, or to try to at least find some stuff that's researchable into that particular thing. Because you don't hear about some of these people today that are even so bragging about philosophy, like Muhammad Hijab. You don't hear him talking about this problem of the one and the many, or try to give a solution or an account for it. But yeah, it was kind of silent for a bit, and then eventually Cornelius Van Til comes around and brings it up again, but provides a solution that hadn't been considered before, and that is the issue of equal ultimacy, the one and the many, of not equal ultimacy in predestination, but rather equal ultimacy in the notion of one and many. Is it one or many? No, it's one and many, and they are equally ultimate. Well, how does this make sense? Well, he explains. It is ultimately derived in the notion of the ultimate one and the many itself, God. That with God, we have this notion of one and many, and that because of this, God is this powerful, supreme being who is transcendent, is the main issue there, is that he is unlike anything in creation. And even with his one and the many, there's a difference in that. Hence why even the knowledge of God, we have knowledge that is similar in regards to God, but it's analogical knowledge, analogical reasoning. meaning we have a finite and limited perspective, but we only have knowledge because we derive it from God himself. But we don't have every single aspect of that knowledge of God because we're finite. We're not all-knowing. That is completely the attribute and the thing that belongs to God. But we have some reflections of some of these particular attributes regarding the matter. And creation itself reveals these particular attributes. That's what we even have in the Bible. You know the phrase, Romans chapter 1. It's in verses 18 through 20, the one that states that these atheists are without excuse. And in fact, let me go ahead and pull up the Word software, so give me a second as it pulls up. Alright. So, there we go. And putting it to the King James because I know it might be weird for some, but I'm just in that kind of mood today. Alright, now. So, and fun fact, we're kind of already there. So, alright, so here we go. So, here we go with our deal here. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who hold the truth in unrighteousness, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them. For God showed it unto them, for the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. So we have in creation, we can see reflections of even the eternal power and Godhead that can be understood with that. And so that's what Van Til would point out is the issue, is that we have with this this God being one and many, and we see this reflection of the one and the many within that regard. So, yeah. I know it might be a bit of a short episode today, but I just want to point out that, this is what has been, I think, a thing that hasn't been really discussed that much. Like, even some of the Christians I talk to haven't considered this option or this thought, and, they're trying to find ways of, like, evidences and arguments for the existence of God, and a lot of them usually even try to, see that it might be hard to try to defend the notion of the Trinitarian God in usage of philosophy. And I would say and argue that if we considered, of course, that one particular transcendental argumentation, now I'm not saying just simply tag and let that be the argument, but the transcendental argument for God's existence in light of other classical arguments, like the moral argument, but argue transcendentally with the moral argument, argue transcendentally with the ontological argument, argue transcendentally for the cosmological argument, to use these arguments, but with the transcendental Trinitarian worldview in mind when arguing in that sense. That's what Frame had noted would be a good solution, because like a lot of people like to say the transcendental argument is the win-all, be-all argument, but I would say that it needs to be supplemented with arguments that are also able to be used, and we shouldn't try to just simply dismiss these other classical arguments that have been utilized in philosophical discourse. But at the same time, the one and the many should then come up. Like I said, when I bring it up to some people, they have an issue with it sometimes, or a struggle. And I've talked with Ahmadi Muslims, and they usually can't really give the account for it. Most of the times they've tried to give Unitarian oneness as the absolute, and therefore distinctions are fabricated. They ask, well, how's that so? Then I explain the whole thing regarding the matter. And because they don't know a bit about the philosophy of it, then they have stumblings and can't really give an account for it. And even those who do have the answer or have engaged in philosophy, sometimes they're usually rooted into it to the point that they'll try to, soften up and be on that middle ground saying, we can't know. We don't have an answer to it because one or many will ultimately fail. And thus, we just know that it exists, but we can't explain it. But that then just means you cannot account for reality, and that even the gods you worship, regardless if you're a Muslim or polytheism or anything like that, you just can't account for it then if you're going to go with that position. But the Unitarian God cannot account for it, which means this applies to Judaism, Islam, and other particular sects that would hold to this, they can't account for it because their ultimate is one. And this therefore would ultimately make things universal and unity as ultimate reality, and distinctions, categories. These are fabrications. These are things that we invented. And then we have the issue of the particulars. This could be applied to the issues of polytheism and certain other different sects that would try to affirm that categories or plurality is the ultimate. But if that is the case, then unity is a distinction. Unity is a fabrication, and there is nothing then there for you that unites the polytheists or these gods into these deals. And this could even have an issue with like what you see in some of the polytheistic YouTubers these days, because they're trying to find, like, at least from what I've seen in some of these deals, is the unity of the heathenry or pagan or polytheistic community. That they need to have this, unity between the different categories. There's the German paganism, the Nordic paganism and polytheism. You have the Greek paganism and polytheism. So you have all these different categories of it, and they're supposed to they're trying to find unity between it as a community. But if the particulars is ultimate, and if therefore that would certainly be the case with the notion of polytheism, from what I've gathered, especially in light of Aristotle, then what you're going to ultimately have is therefore then there is this fake unity. It may be a unity to you, but that's only something that you have invented and come up with. It's a fabrication. The reality is ultimately these categories, these pluralities, these particulars, and therefore it falls apart at that point. But in the Trinity, you have monotheism as the main starting deal there, or not ultimate starting deal, but you just to point out in the statement of things, because ultimately, again, equal ultimacy is what I'm affirming here. We have in one monotheism, and then we have the three persons of the Trinity, so the Trinity for the many. So we have this 3 in 1, triune, one and many, equally ultimate. And with that, we not only at least say the answer therefore is, okay, we got the one and the many. We have the answer in that we say, okay, God is, the ultimate one and many, equally ultimate in that regard. And because of that, we then have the finite and very created one and many that we see in reality today, because it is from a transcendent and ultimate source of that one and many. So, that being said, that's all I want to discuss for that. So hopefully this episode was edifying and it can get you stimulated into the thought. If you're looking for suggestions, anything from Van Til, we'll usually try to bring up this idea about particulars, universals, and the problem of the one and the many. R.J. Rushdoony has written a book on this. Now, mind you, he does try to connect it a lot with some politics in the deal, but that's to be expected, But it's a very good book, and it's a very exhaustive one that he has written. They can even be accessed for free online on certain websites, so be sure to check that out. But yeah, that being said, this has been RC Apologist. Y'all take care. Oh, gotta turn the volume up there. Here we go.